Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Our subject tonight is Neil Simon, who died recently at the age of 91, possibly America's most successful commercial playwright of the 20th century, certainly its most successful comedic playwright. People tend not to think of him in the same category as, say, Edward Albee or Eugene O'Neill or Arthur Miller, but at one point in the 1960s, Neil Simon had 4 plays running at the same time on Broadway, and none of those guys ever did that. In fact, the only guy who ever did that was a guy named Clyde Fitch, and he died in 1909. We'll talk a little bit about Neil Simon's plays, but he graduated to playwriting from being in the stable of the greatest comedy writing team on television in the 1950s, and we're going to emphasize that as well. Before we go on, let's get all of Neil Simon's awards out of the way. He was the recipient of 4 Tony Awards, the Pulitzer Prize, the Kennedy Center Honors in 1995, 4 Writers Guild of America Awards, an American Comedy Awards Lifetime Achievement Honor, and in 1983 he had a Broadway theater named after him when the Alvin Theater was rechristened the Neil Simon Theater, making him the only living playwright to have a theater named after him on Broadway. In addition to all that, he was nominated for several Academy Awards, never won one, and in 2006 he won the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor. On top of all that, he was married 5 times, once to the same woman twice. Neil Simon was a nice Jewish boy, born in New York City in the Bronx, went to DeWitt Clinton High School. His parents had a rather tempestuous marriage, and he didn't have the happiest childhood during the Depression. A little amateur psychologizing, that may have had something to do with his penchant for writing humor. His older brother, Danny, who gave him the nickname Doc, also became an extremely successful comedy writer, very bright guy, and they were actually a comedy writing team for a while. Well, after a brief stint at college, Neil Simon joined the Army, which became the subject of one of his most successful plays, Biloxi Blues. Matthew Broderick starred in that on Broadway. A significant portion of Neil Simon's work was either autobiographical, about his brother or his wives, and then he and Danny came back to New York and wrote for one of the classic television shows in all history, Sid Caesar's Your Show of Shows. We've done the Sid Caesar podcast, and we talked about that. And from Your Show of Shows, he went on to Sid Caesar's next project, Caesar's Hour. We talked about that when we did the Nanette Fabre podcast. And it doesn't seem possible, given how good the writing staff was at Your Show of Shows, but if anything, Caesar's Hour was even better, probably the greatest writing team in television history. Here's Sid Caesar to talk about it.
In one room, there was Mel Tolkien, Lucille Carlin, Neil Simon, Carl Reiner, Mike Stewart, Larry Gelbart, and Woody Allen, and Selma Diamond. And they were all in the same room. And we all pitched, we all wrote together. We had to do a musical. If we were going to do a satire musical, we would send Mel and somebody else out to do the lyrics, and they would come in with a song. In about maybe an hour and a half, they would come in with a song. So this was a writing staff it's a dream team. It really is a dream
team. The 27 Yankees of writers.
That's right. You can't explain it. It's something that happened, as I said before. It's a gathering of great minds, like in the Impressionistic period. You had all these great painters exchanging ideas.
And like artist colonies.
Right. And we were all exchanging ideas and feeding off each other. It was a college in work.
I'm sure Sid didn't mean to leave him out, but he forgot to mention Mel Brooks, who was also part of both Your Show of Shows and Caesar's Hour for a little while. And of course, the writer's room for those 2 shows was the subject of the Dick Van Dyke Show, the movie My Favorite Year, which we talked about when we did the Joe Bologna podcast, and Neil Simon's own play, Laughter on the 23rd Floor. Here Sid Caesar talks about Neil Simon. And if Sid Caesar calls you a genius, you know you're good.
Neil is a real, he's a gentleman. He's a very, very shy man. Great, a genius of talent. And he worked hard, and he does it. And he's a very soft-spoken man, but he knows what he's doing, and he knows it. And he takes it all in. He really does. He's grown tremendously.
And yet he still reached back into his memory and wrote a play based on the experience working with you. How did you feel when you saw Laughter on the 23rd Floor?
I was very honored. I said, that's great. A lot of it was true. Punching holes in the wall.
Another guy in that writer's room we had high words of praise for Neil Simon was Larry Gelbart. Pretty for comedy writer himself, went on to write this little show called MASH for television. He mentions Carl, that's Carl Reiner, of course.
Well, Neil was famous for being very quiet. He would sit by himself. We all sat together, but he seemed more by himself than we did. He would pitch a joke. We were looking for jokes. The subject is, now we're throwing jokes that become the pages for that sketch. He would say something very quietly. Neil would always sit next to Carl. And when he said these quiet little gems, Carl acted as a loudspeaker. He would say, Neil just said, he would say the joke, and we would laugh, and we would put it in. By and large, when you get to a certain point of proficiency as a comedy writer, you kind of throw the good stuff. You are your own editor. You don't just throw anything and hope something sticks to the wall or sticks to the sketch. So things that Neil said tended to be funny. We don't really remember all that we said when we said how we said it. I remember when he was writing Laughter on the 23rd Floor, he asked me for permission to use a joke in the play that he thought I wrote. And I had the damnedest time convincing him that it was his own line.
Well, let's talk about some of his plays now. His first play, Come Blow Your Horn, opened on Broadway in 1961 after 3.5 years of labor and 22 rewrites. The protagonist, a world-wise older brother and his innocent younger sibling who share an apartment, were modeled on Danny and Neil Simon, later made into a movie with the chairman of the board, Frank Sinatra.
It was after about 10 years of writing for radio and then television when I said, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. I think I can do better. But I was very much afraid to make that first attempt because I had so many friends who wrote their first play that closed in 2 nights and never went back to it. I fought night and day to make sure that this wouldn't fail, but no one came to buy any tickets, and they put the closing notice up. And there's a very famous agent named Irving Lazar. He was a good friend of Noel Coward, and he took Noel Coward to see the play that night. He saw the play, then went to a restaurant where a famous columnist for the newspapers came up to him at dinner and said, well, what'd you do tonight in town, Noel? And he said, I saw the funniest play in town, Come Blow Your Horn. The next day it was in the paper, and the day after that we had a line around the block.
Here's a brief clip of some of his plays after Come Blow Your Horn, and he was so prolific you can't go into them all.
Growing up in New York in the 60s and 70s meant a Yankee game in the Bronx, a sandwich from Horn and Hardart, and a Neil Simon play on Broadway. Over the course of more than 2 decades, no one painted more unforgettable characters or brought more joy to audiences than Neil Simon.
This is from Barefoot in the Park, starring Robert Redford and Elizabeth Ashley on Broadway, and our old buddy Jane Fonda got the Elizabeth Ashley part for the movie.
Officer! We just got married! Did you miss me today?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Dooley. Next time you're in New York, just call me up.
Simon won the 1991 Pulitzer Prize for Lost in Yonkers that starred a young Kevin Spacey and Mercedes Ruehl. And in the movie, Mercedes Ruehl reprised her part, and the Kevin Spacey role is played by Richard Dreyfuss. I always thought he overact a little in these Neil Simon plays. That's just me, I guess.
Don't yell at me, Louie! I'm not yelling at you, Bella! I'm asking you a question. Who does that leave to put up the $5,000?
You terrible mama, please tell her.
Who does that leave, Bella?
Oh, I would get the money somewhere, Louie.
Where is somewhere? Bella, there is no somewhere. You want Mama to sell the store. Is that what this guy is asking you to do?
No, he didn't ask me anything.
Well, either this guy is very, very smart or he's very dangerous. And he don't sound very smart to me, so that only leaves dangerous.
He is not dangerous.
How do you know that?
They don't take you at the home if you're dangerous.
Simon wrote the semi-autobiographical Eugene Trilogy, Brighton Beach Memoirs, Biloxi Blues, and Broadway Bound. Made a star out of Matthew Broderick. This is from Biloxi Blues.
Where are you from, Jerome?
1427 Pulaski Avenue.
I've been in this army for 12 years, and I never met one damn dog face who came from 1427 Pulaski Avenue. Now, why is that, Jerome?
Because it's my home, only my family.
Oscar winners, Emmy winners, Tony winners. It seems a good actor just can't lose when they've got a part in a Simon play. And for some, it would mark the beginning of a great career.
Neil Simon cast me in my very first Broadway show. It was Brighton Beach Memoirs. I read for the part 4 or 5, maybe 6 times, and I did get the part somehow. And it made me the happiest, most fulfilling start to a career any actor could hope for.
Of all the indelible characters and unforgettable stories Neil Simon has brought us, few have brought audiences to laughter and tears quite like the story of Eugene Morris Jerome.
I hate my name. Eugene Morris Jerome. How am I ever going to play for the Yankees with a name like that?
In Brighton Beach Memoirs, we discover just how funny and loving family could be and what growing up was all about through the eyes of 14-year-old Eugene.
All the best Yankees are Italian. My mother makes spaghetti with ketchup. What chance do I have?
In Broadway Bound, we revisited the Jerome household a decade later, only to discover that no matter how much the world may change, family is forever.
And when they saw the Statue of Liberty, they started to cry. The women were wailing, the men were shaking, everybody praying. You know why? Because they took one look at that statue and said, That's not a Jewish woman. We're going to have problems again.
To these two remarkable plays, theatergoers around the world came to discover that the magic of Neil Simon isn't merely the wonderful words he writes, it's the unforgettable truths he reveals.
Here are Nathan Lane, Richard Dreyfuss, and Steve Martin saluting him at the Mark Twain Awards.
He created his own style of comedy, plays that have made us scream with laughter or cry at the recognition of something in our own lives, plays that will live forever.
In 150 years, very few people will be remembered from this time, but we will all know Neil. We will all know his take on the world because he gets us right.
Neil, you have taken the stuff of life, marriage, divorce, love, death, and written about it so hilariously that it took years for anyone to notice that you captured an entire time in 20th century American life. Thank you, Neil, for a lifetime of wonderful art given to the world through the fine point of your pen.
Well, he wrote a whole bunch of other stuff like California Suite, The Goodbye Girl with his then-wife Marcia Mason. I thought that one was completely overrated, by the way. Dreyfuss won the Academy Award for that one. Last of the Red Hot Lovers. You could go on and on. Probably some good Neil Simon gossip with Marcia Mason. He dressed down Mary Tyler Moore when she didn't know the lines to one of his plays. I mean, he could be tough. I feel obligated to give you a little bit of the contemporary take on Neil Simon. You know, he won the Pulitzer in 1991 for Lost in Yonkers. But after that, he never had another big hit. Most of his plays, with one exception, have never been recreated on Broadway. Since then, he remains a staple of dinner theater across the country. So critics and writers say that he lost his edge or that he didn't keep up with contemporary standards, and his type of humor, based out of the Borscht Belt, went out of favor. I don't know if any of that's fair. I mean, he was in his 60s when Lost in Yonkers came out, and how many playwrights actually do great work in their 60s or beyond? So there's a school of thought that he'll be forgotten. Contra Dreyfuss's contention that he'll be remembered for 150 years. I don't know that I buy any of that. I'll let you decide for yourself, but it's clear one of his plays won't be forgotten, and it is still performed all over today. And that's unquestionably his most popular play, The Odd Couple. It was on Broadway in 1965, starring Art Carney and Walter Matthau. Then it was made into the well-known movie in 1968 with Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon. And of course you got your TV show with Jack Klugman and Tony Randall. It's alternatively about either Danny Simon's divorce or Mel Brooks' divorce. And there's a famous story about the notorious third act. The first two acts of the three-act play were brilliant in out-of-town tryouts, but the third act was a dud. And Neil Simon was at a loss of what to do until someone suggested he bring back the Pigeon Sisters. He talked it over with Mike, that's Mike Nichols, whose podcast we've done. And here Simon tells the story.
I wrote a piece for the Pigeon Sisters, another scene for them, and we laughed so hard at rehearsals that Mike said, we can't put this on the stage because we will be accused of manslaughter. People will be carried out of the theater dying from laughter. We did get it on that night and did not get a single laugh in the Pigeon Sisters scene. And they were wonderful, the two actresses. I walked out dejected again, realizing how difficult this playwriting business is. You think you have it, and like quicksilver, it's gone. I said, what went wrong, Mike? And he said, they don't like what's happening in the scene. They don't like the turn of the story. If you could find another thing that they can relate to and understand, then maybe the laughs would come easier. Knowing that, I went home, and it took me a couple of days, and I did it, and I gave it to them. Now, we didn't laugh so much at rehearsal, but then we put it in that night, and we got huge laughs, even when the lines weren't funny, because the audiences now were enjoying the sense of the comedy, the progression of the play itself, the characters coming into their own and learning something about themselves. The third act still never lives up to the other two acts, but the play is the biggest hit I ever had and ever will have. Here it is 35 years later, I think, and the play is doing as well as it ever did.
Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. Neil Simon never made much money off the television version of The Odd Couple, some sort of business transaction. I never saw Art Carney on Broadway, but my personal opinion, I'll take Tony Randall and Jack Klugman over Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau. The only musical tribute we can end with to Neil Simon is, of course, the Odd Couple theme. We'll go with the original done by another Neil, Neil Hefti, as a tribute to one of the 20th century's great playwrights.